In this episode of Assignment Discovery, we're exploring the Muslim world in Islam, history, society, and civilization.
First, watch as a Middle Eastern merchant's divine revelation gives birth to a world religion in The History and Teachings of Islam. Then, see how competition over sacred lands led to one of the bloodiest holy wars in history in the Crusades.
Next, see how the leadership of a single man created one of the world's greatest empires in Suleiman, magnificent leader. Finally, see the devastating consequences of religion taken to the extreme in Afghanistan, 12 years of violence.
The Muslim world unveiled today on Assignment Discovery.
As you watch the next two segments on the origin of Islam and the Crusades, keep these questions in mind.
Where did Islam start, and how did it spread?
What did people in the Middle East and Europe learn about each other during the Crusades?
Along with Christianity and Judaism, Islam is one of the world's top 3 monotheistic religions, or religions based on a single god. Yet, for non-Muslims, Islam is also one of the most misunderstood religions. What do you know about Islam?
The founder of our culture was a person named Muhammad.
Their scriptures called the Quran. It's monotheistic. Their God is Allah.
Praise Allah.
A lot of us who are extremely religious pray around like 5 times a day.
It was based out of the Middle East. Women have to wear burqas, I think they're called.
The essential part of our culture is to make peace with each other.
Islam is a religion practiced by more than 1 billion people worldwide. The word Islam means submission to God in Arabic. A person who practices Islam is called a Muslim, which means one who submits. It's the second largest religion after Christianity and the fastest growing religion in the world. About 4 million Muslims live in the United States. Islam got its start 1400 years ago with one man, the Prophet Muhammad. In the year 610, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was a 40-year-old merchant in the ancient city of Mecca, in what is today Saudi Arabia. Muhammad had a divine revelation that he was one in the great line of prophets, stretching back from Jesus to Abraham. Allah, which is the Arabic name for God, told Muhammad that he must spread God's word to all humanity. Muhammad based his sermons on his divine revelations. As he preached around Mecca, he spoke out against corruption in society and how the rich were neglecting the poor. Threatened by his teachings, the powers that be in Mecca forced Muhammad into exile in 622. For the next decade, Muhammad continued preaching in the city of Medina and amassed thousands of followers. When he marched on Mecca in 630, the city fell without a fight, and Mecca has been the spiritual home of Islam ever since. The Quran is the Islamic holy book. Written in Arabic, it is said to be the divine word of God passed directly to Muhammad. Muhammad did not write down the Quran himself. Some of it may have been dictated during his lifetime, but much remains scattered in written fragments and in the memory of his followers after his death. After Muhammad's death, followers of Islam forged a vast empire that extended from Spain and North Africa to Southeast Asia. Islam spread widely because Muslims everywhere belonged to the same community of believers, all worshiping the same God and reading the same holy book in the same language, regardless of what country they lived in or what their native language was. The building for worship used by Muslims is the mosque. Mosques are designed after Muhammad's home in Medina, which had a surrounding courtyard and columned hall. They are often decorated with geometric floral designs and elaborate patterns. These designs are used because Islam forbids imitating God's work by imitating living creatures in religious art. Five times a day, a cry echoes through Muslim communities. It's the muezzin, the holy crier, calling all Muslims to pray. Everywhere in the world, Muslims stop and kneel in the direction of Mecca and recite prayers to Allah 5 times a day, at dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and nightfall. This ritual has been part of Muslim daily life since the 7th century. Muslims follow the 5 pillars of Islam. They define duties that must be performed, declaring one's faith, ritual prayer, charity, spiritual discipline and fasting, and pilgrimage. The Quran's 114 chapters, or surahs, also include teachings on basic human rights and tolerance for other religions. In some Islamic cultures, it's common for women to wear veils, but women can also share many of the same responsibilities and rights as men. Some practices of Islam, such as taking more than one wife, are observed by very few modern Muslims. Today, fewer than 1/5 of the Muslims in the world are Arabs. Followers of Islam can now be found around the globe. And it all began in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, 1400 years ago.
Did you know Ramadan is the 9th month of the Muslim lunar calendar year? It commemorates the first revelation of the Quran. During this period, Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset and dedicate themselves to prayer and contemplation. The last day of Ramadan is celebrated by a day of feasting.
The Crusades were a battle between Christians and Muslims for control over lands in the Middle East that they both held sacred. They were a struggle between not only armies, but faiths. Are places ever worth fighting over?
Well, you have your church, which you would fight over to protect your religion.
My house.
Like historical places,
Probably definitely Mecca, Jerusalem, because it's a really sacred place for a lot of religious people.
My grandparents' house in India because it was named after their 2 kids who died.
America in general. I mean, it's where I live, you know.
May 18th, 1291. A conflict that has raged for 200 years finally nears an end. A massive Muslim assault breaks the walls of the last Christian stronghold in the Middle East. At a fortress near Jerusalem, desperate holdouts endure the final attack in a medieval holy war.
So the idea of the Crusades, the symbolism of the Crusades, became the clash of civilizations.
At a place called Acre, the dream of a Christian-controlled Holy Land is shattered.
The fall of Acre in 1291 was a key event because it marked the end, effectively, the end of the story of the Crusades in the Holy Land.
At last, from beneath the ruins, the evidence reveals how the warriors on both sides of the Crusades lived, fought, and died. For more than 2 centuries, Christian and Muslim armies are locked in a deadly struggle for control of the Holy Land. From 1096 to 1291, lands in the Middle East change hands in a series of 8 brutal wars. When the fighting finally ends, tens of thousands are dead. In the late 11th century, Muslim sultans rule most of North Africa, Spain, and the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. The Christian world is split. Europe is a collection of small states and kingdoms. To the east, the Byzantine Empire is controlled from its capital in Constantinople, what would later become Istanbul in Turkey.
The Crusades give us a model, they give us a template of the clash of religions and the clash of civilizations and the clash of continents.
In the Middle East, Accra is a lively Muslim city on the coast of what is modern-day Israel.
There's no denying that it was a major port and a major commercial center. Both commercial and military, those are the 2 points. You can't just look at it in a military sense.
Accra is also the gateway to a most sacred place. It is called the Holy Land. At its core is Jerusalem, a city sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. But violence has plagued this region for centuries.
Many Muslims, particularly in the Middle East, see the creation and the manner of the creation of Israel as an extension of the Crusades themselves. That is, the arrival and the presence of Westerners.
Beginning almost 1,000 years ago, a series of wars transformed this center of faith into an unholy battlefield. Today, archaeologists probe the moment in time when the cycle of fighting began.
You say it was about, I'd say it was about 3 pounds there.
In England, scientists research the role of military technology.
The idea that the Western Europeans came in with some kind of superior military technology, and that's why the First Crusade was able to win, I think is complete baloney.
Historians piece together the personality clash between England's King Richard I, called Richard the Lionheart for his courage, and the Muslim hero, Saladin.
Saladin is a magnificent figure because of the generosity of his character and the generosity of his spirit.
Richard arrives as a brawling, drunken football hooligan, and by the end of his tour to the Middle East, he's a changed man.
What forces drove these men? What motives sparked and fueled 2 centuries of war? Return to the year 1095. The Christian world is in turmoil. Islamic armies take control of the eastern end of the Byzantine Empire. And power struggles between rival knights wreak havoc in Europe. The Catholic Church is the sole source of unification. It's centralized and politically influential. The Church's leader, Pope Urban II, decides to take strong action.
Here was this Pope Urban II who looked across Europe and saw all this bloodshed going on between these knights, and they had all this warrior energy, and they were just fighting one another all the time. And in a kind of inspiration, he declared that he should harness all of this energy towards a noble quest.
Pope Urban declares that Christians must liberate the Holy Land from its Muslim rulers. In 1096, the First Crusaders prepare for their journey.
The First Crusade is kind of a hodgepodge. It's not a fancy military enterprise. A lot of people and a lot of common people become involved. It's a very popular movement.
From across Europe, tens of thousands join the quest, including hordes of peasants, all a bit unclear of their mission.
Those who set off had a rather hazy notion, most of them, of what they were doing.
The Crusaders did cause havoc. How were they to live? How were they to sustain themselves? It was almost like Sherman's march through the South. I mean, they had to live off the land, so they were not welcomed as they moved along.
As they head east, the peasant mob spins out of control. Lacking any real direction or leadership, a German mob of crusaders along the Rhine River massacre thousands of Jews. And 4,000 Hungarians are killed in one town alone. Before they can make it across Eastern Europe, most of the peasant crusaders have turned back or died of disease. The news of these massacres in Europe does not concern the Muslims in Jerusalem.
The great majority of people in the Islamic world, they simply regarded Western Europeans as a load of ignorant thugs, useless for anything, really. So much so that they had virtually no interest in them.
Christian military forces depart from Europe in 1096. After a 3-year march, they finally push into the Holy Land. May 1099. The first elements of the Crusader armies reach Jerusalem. Inside the city walls, the Muslim and Jewish defenders consider their options.
The Muslims are inside preparing for war. They're looking out, they're seeing all of these foreign troops are coming in to conquer the city. So what do? They boil oil, they sharpen their spears, they count their weapons.
In June 1099, the Crusaders surrounding Jerusalem halt. They may be fanatics, but they're not ignorant.
The Crusaders spend from June 6th to July 14th building and understanding how to attack the city. They send their architects around, trying to understand the weaknesses of the city itself.
The city's perimeters are impressive. Jerusalem is surrounded by fortified walls, but the Crusader engineers find a weak spot not in the walls, but in the landscape.
This is actually the spot where the Crusaders breached the walls of the old city. It was the spot that throughout history has been used because this is the flattest area in Jerusalem. In the northern part of the city right here, that's where Jerusalem can only be defeated.
July 7th, 1099, the battle for Jerusalem begins. Jerusalem falls to the Crusaders on the 8th day of the campaign. The Christians overwhelm the Jewish and Muslim defenders of Jerusalem. The Crusaders turn their siege into a massacre. Historians estimate that between 10,000 and 20,000 Muslims were killed. The Crusaders also burn a synagogue, killing many of Jerusalem's Jews who fled there for sanctuary.
Jerusalem is so associated with the massacre of Muslims and Jews in that military triumph that it is tainted in history.
It was seen as barbaric, uncalled for, and it created a great demand for revenge and retaliatory action.
In the following years, the Christians erect 45 churches, many built on the ruins of mosques and synagogues. They also build fortresses to defend them. The Holy Land in the year 1160. 60 years after the siege of Jerusalem, the Crusaders have established 4 states in the Holy Land that are protected by 60 strongholds.
Now, these castles are very strong, much bigger in many cases than the castles from the same period within Western Europe.
They build these fortresses on high ground so they can see for miles in all directions. Yet, despite their lofty vantage points, the Crusaders are blind to another threat. After Jerusalem falls to the Crusaders in 1099, a new leader unites the Muslim world 80 years later. His name is Saladin. While Crusaders weakly control the Holy Land, Saladin unifies the lands known today as Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and northern Iraq.
There is no modern political leader you can compare to Salahuddin.
Saladin is a 41-year-old warrior and sultan from what is now Iraq.
Here you have a man who was a convinced, pious Muslim, but he was also a realistic ruler. He was not a naive innocent. He was not a saint. By and large, there's no denying that Saladin he's a hero.
Saladin's secretary describes his leader.
Whenever the Sultan shook hands with someone, he would not let go his hand until that person had taken the initiative to do so. He was a paragon of chivalry, generous, extremely modest, and had a welcoming face.
But how comfortable was Saladin on the battlefield? Was he merciful or ruthless?
He was not a saint, or indeed he could show considerable ruthlessness.
Crusaders are hard at work building a castle at a strategic site, a site called Vadam Yaqub. Saladin attacks before the Europeans can finish their work. The Muslim army breaks into the castle, defended by about 1,500 men. The Crusaders are killed, their bodies dumped into a mass grave. Saladin's victory at Vadam Yaqub keeps the Christians from fighting for a while. The Crusaders and Muslims sign and break a series of peace treaties. When the Crusaders attack Muslims making their pilgrimage to Mecca, Saladin invokes an Islamic practice almost forgotten until then. He declares a jihad.
Jihad is a declaration of holy war, and it's a holy war for defensive purposes. Salahuddin declares a holy war, and that's what unites the Muslims.
What the Crusades succeeded in doing was reviving this aspect of jihad.
20,000 Crusaders learn this in 1187. When they confront the Muslim forces at a place called Hattin, they are trapped.
The trap which Saladin sprung on the Crusaders was brilliant. The Crusader fighters were coming from this direction, making their way down below to the fresh water badly needed in the Sea of Tiberias. When they got to this point, the trap was sprung. Saladin sent out thousands of archers from this cliff face and shot arrows down at the Crusader army.
Historians believe the mobility and accuracy of Saladin's archers were unparalleled. At the Battle of Hattin, Muslim archers give Saladin the advantage. The entire Crusader force is taken prisoner or killed. More traumatic is Saladin's capture of the holiest relic in Christianity, what Crusaders believe are pieces of the cross on which Jesus died. Christians call this relic the true cross.
When there would be a great military battle, the Crusaders stupidly would take out this great relic that he had. They would have divine providence. And it was interesting the way in which it was used as a bargaining chip, because it was of no value to the Muslim side and of great religious value to the Christian side.
A defeated knight sums up the Crusaders' despair.
Lord God, our war is over. We are nothing but dead men, and the kingdom has come to an end.
Hattin is important because this is where Salahuddin establishes himself as a military genius. It is Hattin and the fall of Hattin that really opens up and turns round the Crusades.
After Saladin's decisive victory at Hattin, he takes back the port city of Acre. 3 months later, in 1188, the Muslims win the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. The news reaches Europe that Jerusalem and the true cross are lost. It was reported that the Pope died from the shock. Saladin enters Jerusalem in triumph, not in fury. He takes control of the holiest Christian shrine in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Instead of destroying the church, Saladin opens its doors to Christian pilgrims, many of them members of competing religious groups. To prevent one Christian faction from shutting out the other, Saladin places the keys of the church in the hands of two Muslim families. Their descendants remain the gatekeepers of the church to this day. Saladin's generosity fails to impress the European rulers, who declare another crusade with a new leader. This time, Saladin meets his match. June 7, 1191. A 34-year-old English king sets foot in the Holy Land at the port city of Acre.
Richard the Lionheart was a war lover. He was the greatest warrior of his time, a great athlete.
Richard the Lionheart is not your typical English king. He has spent a total of 6 months in England, and his native language is French. But he also speaks the universal language, money. He promises the Crusaders gold for each stone they remove from the walls of Acre. Winning Acre will give Richard a beachhead in the Holy Land. But to retake the port, they'll have to breach defenses the Crusaders built when they ruled the city. June 11th, 1191. Pulling Acre apart brick by brick will take too long. To conquer the fort, Richard's army needs a shortcut. The solution? Portable attack platforms called siege towers. Rolled up to the enemy wall, the soldiers climb stairways to the top of Acre's walls. Saladin's secretary describes the psychological impact.
It overtopped the city wall. The city garrison were greatly fearful of it and were tempted to ask for terms.
July 12, 1191. Little more than a month after Richard's arrival, the city of Acre falls to the Crusaders. Richard soon grows impatient when Saladin is slow to negotiate the terms of surrender. The English king orders Muslim prisoners led out of the city. One by one, they're killed, 2,700 men in all.
And this is a great stain on Richard's reputation historically, and undercuts the kind of mythologizing and romanticizing of Richard in European lore.
Despite a long tradition of bloodshed, Richard finally tries diplomacy. At a military stalemate with Saladin, he sends an offer to his enemy.
Come here and listen well to my words. The country is utterly ruined, and goods and lives have been sacrificed on both sides. The time has come to stop this.
Richard sends a wish list to Saladin. At the top is Jerusalem and the True Cross. Saladin's reply is swift and sharp.
The city is as holy to us as it is to you. It is therefore out of the question for us to abandon it. As for the cross, it is a great trump in our hands, and we will surrender it only in return for some important concession.
According to legend, the only concession Richard has to offer is his own flesh and blood.
I propose that my sister, Queen Joanna, marry Melek el-Adel, Saladin's brother. Once married, the couple would become the joint rulers of the new kingdom of Jerusalem, with their royal seat in Jerusalem.
But Richard's sister refuses. The deal is off. But both sides are talking, instead of fighting.
There's an interesting relationship that develops between Richard and Salahuddin over the years that Richard is in the Middle East. Correspondence, exchanges of gifts, exchange of fruit, even exchanges of doctors when Richard falls ill. And this shows the kind of respect that both develop for each other.
When Richard falls sick with fever, Saladin's personal physician makes a house call. And brings fruit juice cooled with snow from a distant mountain. When help comes from an enemy, it brings with it a hope for peace.
When we arrive at an understanding, we will meet and friendship will prevail between us.
Richard and Saladin never do meet in person, but on September 2nd, 1192, the two great warriors make peace. The terms? Acre stays a Christian stronghold. Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands, but Saladin guarantees safe passage for pilgrims of all faiths to the Holy City. And what happened to the true cross? Along with the Holy Grail and the Lost Ark, it too is lost to history. After spending a year and a half in the Holy Land, Richard departs for Europe empty-handed.
Richard the Lionheart spent 5 years, mobilized all of Europe, bankrupted England to come to capture Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre. Got to the gates of Jerusalem and decided to give it all. But I don't think he thought of himself as a failure.
The religious access to Jerusalem forged by Richard and Saladin outlives them both. But the winds of war will stir again 100 years after their deaths. Once again, crusaders come to the port of Acre. The summer 1290, a century after Saladin and Richard make peace, Acre remains the last major Christian foothold in the Holy Land. Here, Europeans trade goods and ideas freely with the Muslims. But the dialogue soon breaks down as Muslim and Christian leaders renew their power struggle. European kings enlist 12,000 newly recruited crusaders, mostly Italians, who arrive in the summer of 1290. They are supposed to help preserve the peace. Instead, they end it. By the end of August, Acre is shattered. The Crusaders go on a rampage. They consider anyone wearing a beard a Muslim, and they kill him on sight. News of the massacre soon reaches the rulers of the Holy Land, a collection of Muslim warriors from Egypt known as Mamelukes.
A Mamluk is a man who is of slave origin, purchased as a child or as an adolescent, and then is trained to a very, very high degree as a professional soldier, but he's also made literate. He's educated. He's not just a thug soldier. And when he's fully trained, he is released.
A Mameluke army gathers outside Acre's walls. Ultimately, some 200,000 warriors surround the city. The Mameluke strategy is described in this account.
He pitched his tents, set up 60 machines, and without any respite, assailed the city with fire, stones, and arrows.
Today, Acre's streets hold the evidence of that final assault.
These ballista are ancient cannonballs. The Mamelukes catapulted these things into the fortress itself, and they're found all over the place here.
Muslim catapults chip away at the fortress walls and the Crusaders' courage.
It's mostly the psychological impact of these things crashing in on a regular basis. It's a form of artillery bombardment. Where do you hide? There's nowhere to go. This thing could drop on your head any minute.
There is a saying in the Middle East: do not consider any act of kindness insignificant. But kindness in the final days of Acre takes a back seat to rank. Although the fort is surrounded by hostile forces, ancient accounts report some groups of Christians make a getaway. But how? 7 centuries later, after months of exhausting excavations, archaeologists discover the answer: a subterranean escape route for members only. Crusader Knights take the tunnel out of Acre. This extraordinary exit stretches more than 1,000 feet from the fort to the Mediterranean Sea.
The tunnel connected the Templar castle in the west to the harbor in the east.
A military religious group called the Knights Templar built the tunnel. Members of this group are sworn to protect Christian pilgrims, but they also protect the secrecy of their exit strategy.
This is a private tunnel. No one knew except the Templars that there is such a tunnel. In the last day of Acre, the Templar Knights managed to escape through this tunnel to the harbor and then run away to Europe.
Never again are the Holy Lands occupied by the Crusaders.
The fall of Acre in 1291 was a key event. It was the end of the story. It was the last major enclave to fall.
In the end, Muslim culture is unaffected by the ways of the Europeans.
The impact on the Muslim world was minimal because here was a civilization already at a peak. And what they brought, the Europeans and the Crusaders brought to the Middle East, was simply ideas of war and warriors and sometimes brutal savagery.
Their dream in ruins, the Crusaders leave the Holy Land. But long before the Crusades began, Muslim ideas take root on the European continent.
What was positive for Europe was the idea of civilization, which means chivalry, which means learning, which means books, which means a way of life, which means cleanliness in personal hygiene and personal diet.
Scholars are stimulated by exposure to more advanced mathematics and astronomy. Italian merchants profit by ferrying pilgrims and trade goods to and from the Holy Land. New prosperity and trade stimulates cultural growth. The dialogue Saladin and Richard began 700 years earlier led to tolerance in the Holy Land. Today, many in the Middle East see that distant truce as a pilgrimage worth taking again. In the Holy Land streets where the Crusaders fought Muslims and Jews lies hope for everlasting peace.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
Where did Islam start, and how did it spread?
What did people in the Middle East and Europe learn about each other during the Crusades?
If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.
As you watch the next 2 segments on the Muslim world, keep these questions in mind.
How did Suleiman the Magnificent change the Ottoman Empire?
How has power changed hands in Afghanistan since the 1990s?
Suleiman the Magnificent was the Muslim leader of one of the world's biggest empires. But, unlike other empires of the day, he let the people he conquered keep their own religions. How would you react if someone forced a religion on you?
I don't think it's right for someone to tell you what to pray.
I would be opposed to someone forcing their religion on me.
I wouldn't really like that much because I would like to believe in what I believe in. I'd probably try to fight it if there are enough people against it.
I wouldn't let them convert me to whatever religion they want to.
What you believe in is like you, and uprooting that belief is like uprooting them as a person.
I'm going to pray for what I pray and believe in what I believe.
The Ottoman Empire experienced a golden age between 1520 and 1566. During this time, Suleiman led the empire as Sultan, a title given to the ruler of Muslim countries. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire reached the height of its power and prestige. Suleiman turned the capital city of Constantinople, now called Istanbul in present-day Turkey, into the center of a vast Muslim empire that eventually spread to Central Europe, North Africa, and Persia, modern-day Iran. When he first came to power after the death of his father, no one suspected that Suleiman would become the empire's greatest sultan. Muslims respected him and came to call him the lawgiver. He was a patron of literature and the arts. He surrounded himself with writers, painters, and musicians. He even wrote poetry himself. He hired great architects to build magnificent mosques and other buildings throughout the empire. In pursuit of justice, he freed people who had been unjustly imprisoned and fired corrupt bureaucrats. Many people living in the empire were captured slaves. Suleiman allowed some to move up within the ranks of society and government based on their merit and abilities. In fact, his closest advisor, Ibrahim, was a former slave. These new opportunities made the slaves extremely loyal to Suleiman. Suleiman's army was strengthened by attacks on conquered Christians that required them to turn over their young sons to the government. These Christian children were then raised and trained to become Muslim soldiers. The best soldiers joined the ranks of the Janissaries, the elite force of Suleiman's army. Janissaries had to convert to Islam, follow strict rules, display high moral standards, and swear allegiance to the Sultan. Suleiman's army used new military technology that contributed to its success. Muskets provided greater firepower for foot soldiers. And their use of cannons gave the army a huge advantage over most enemies. The Ottoman Empire was a Muslim state, but the empire's diverse population also included Jews and Christians. Although he was a devout Muslim himself, Suleiman realized that forcing a new religion on the cultures he conquered could fuel rebellion. So, unlike other rulers of the day, he allowed his conquered subjects to continue worshiping as they always had. As long as he had people's loyalty, they could keep their religion. Muslims called Suleiman the lawgiver because he revised Ottoman laws and improved the justice system. He even made new codes governing the markets and traders that helped turn the empire into the richest in the world. His laws, like those of other Muslim states, were based on the Sharia, the religious law of Islam. By 1540, Suleiman ruled half the civilized world and had the other half trying to buy him off. Suleiman's military victories and enlightened rule led Westerners to call him Suleiman the Magnificent. During his reign, Suleiman expanded the Ottoman Empire to include parts of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. But Suleiman's rule finally weakened and declined because he feared opposition from within his family and among his close advisors. One of Suleiman's wives, Roxalana, an ex-slave, wanted her own son to become Suleiman's heir. She convinced Suleiman that his eldest and most popular son had devised a plot to overthrow him. In 1553, to stop this perceived takeover, Suleiman had his son and many others murdered. Suleiman's rule never recovered from these ruthless actions. The poets he had supported so generously in the past now wrote about him with contempt. Perhaps racked with guilt, Suleiman turned to a life of private seclusion. In 1566, Suleiman, now an old man, led an assault on the Hungarian city of Szigetvar. The 72-year-old Suleiman would not live to see the battle's end. He died in his tent before his troops took the city. But Suleiman had succeeded in bringing prosperity to the Ottoman Empire. He expanded its territory, improved the government and legal systems, strengthened the military, supported the arts, promoted religious tolerance, improved the lives of slaves, and built great mosques and palaces throughout the empire. These achievements remain his greatest legacy.
Did you know cannons played a key role in Suleiman's military successes? The Turks could make bronze cannons that were strong enough to withstand the burst of gunpowder. Suleiman's foundries turned out bronze cannons on a massive scale. This added firepower gave his troops a great advantage over most of the armies they faced.
During Afghanistan's recent history, a radical Islamic group came to power in the country. While some people welcomed their rule, many others felt threatened and oppressed by their extreme interpretation of Islamic law. Do you think other countries should get involved when people within a country are being oppressed?
If another country is being oppressed, like slaughtered and abused, I think we should step in and try to mediate the situation.
No, because then it puts your country or whoever country is trying to get involved in an awkward position.
If we're an ally or if it's somewhere close to us, if there's a problem between two groups of people because of religion, then someone should step in to help.
If they see basic civil liberties being disrespected, then as a powerful nation, it's their job to make sure that everybody's treated fairly.
Afghanistan is a country in South-Central Asia. Steep, rugged mountains cover much of the land. It is an arid and inhospitable place. But Afghanistan's location, on a strategic land route between India, Iran, and Central Asia, has attracted traders and conquerors throughout its long history. The armies of Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan were followed in modern times by those of the British and the Soviets. The Soviet Union invaded in 1979, but it was forced to withdraw a decade later by the Afghani Mujahideen, a group of guerrilla fighters backed and trained by the United States, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and other countries. The Russians left behind a communist government. But in 1992, Mujahideen guerrillas and other Islamic rebels captured the capital city of Kabul and set up a new government. Still, the killing didn't stop. Over the next few years, rival groups fought each other for control. Civil war spread throughout the country. And a new group arose, called the Taliban, a name that means religious student. The Taliban consisted of devout Islamic guerrilla fighters and refugees returning from Pakistan. Many had studied at the madrasas or religious schools on the Pakistani border. Angry that the Mujahideen had failed to fully enforce Islamic law, the Taliban's leaders declared a jihad, a holy struggle, against the Mujahideen. By early 1995, the Taliban had seized power in the city of Kandahar in southeastern Afghanistan. The Taliban had been welcomed there because they replaced chaos and corruption with order. Over the next 2 years, the Taliban fought fiercely against rival factions, swiftly seizing power over most of Afghanistan. Taliban leaders claimed that their aim was to set up a strictly Islamic state, unlike any other in the Muslim world. They followed an extreme interpretation of the Quran, Islamic law, and Afghan tribal laws and customs.
In Islam, there are a great respect for men and women, for the neighbors, for the non-Muslims, for the properties, and there are rules and regulations in Islam, even how to eat, how to sleep, how to walk, and how to talk with the people.
The Taliban violently opposed Western influences. Television sets were strung up on posts at the city gates. Chess, football, even kite flying were banned. And women were allowed outside only when wearing traditional full-length burqas. Movie theaters were closed and music was forbidden. Taliban officials ripped out offensive cassette tapes. Afghanistan was effectively closed off from most of the outside world. The Taliban then closed down girls' schools and sent female teachers home on religious grounds. During the Soviet occupation, education and employment for women had been on the rise. Now, basic schooling was forbidden for girls. And any woman that challenged her new place in society was quickly punished. The Taliban leadership insisted their actions were just and necessary, and based on Sharia, religious law of Islam. But a growing number of Muslims in Afghanistan, both women and men, disagreed with the Taliban's harsh interpretation of Islam.
I felt that I have no worth in this society. I cannot do anything for this society, and this society cannot do anything for me. They cannot accept me as a human being.
The Taliban was finally removed from power by a US-led military coalition after the Taliban leadership was linked to the terrorist attacks in the United States on September 11, 2001. A transitional government was set up. It included women, and it made plans for a new constitution and free elections. Countries from around the world contributed money and armed peacekeepers to rebuild the country and maintain order. But divisions and conflict continued in Afghanistan. Rivalries between ethnic groups and warlords threatened the country's stability. And the Taliban, having retreated to the mountains, continued to direct guerrilla raids against foreign peacekeepers and planned for the day when they might return to power.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
How did Suleiman the Magnificent change the Ottoman Empire?
How has power changed hands in Afghanistan since the 1990s?
We hope you've enjoyed this assignment discovery journey into the world of Islam. If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.